coins. And she laughs. She has no fear. She laughs at the day to come. In the Hebrew Bible, the very next story is the story of Ruth, foreign, Moabite, widow, poor, grouped in among the most marginalized, who is also called by this title, an Eshet Chayil. So it's worth thinking more about why is it Israel reserves that title for just those two women. Lastly, it's important to know that the Book of Ruth is part of the 5 megalot, these small scrolls, each of which is read or is used during one of the festivals of the year, one of the festivals of the Jewish calendar. And in the case of Ruth, Ruth is read in the festival of weeks, or the time of gathering, of harvest. It's also the time most associated with the giving of the law to the Jewish community by God at Sinai. So again, you have this sense of connection. She is celebrated alongside, or as evoking, this moment where Israel receives the gift of Torah. Okay, so canonical placement gives us a little bit of hints about the stories and its story and its significance. But when was it written? When do we think the Book of Ruth was written? Well, the book has been dated anywhere from the 10th century, the time of monarchy, all the way down to what we call the Persian period, when the Persian Empire was on the world stage, which is the last third or so of the 6th century, all the way down to the rise of Alexander the Great in 331. So this is this period in which Israel has returned. Those who had been taken into captivity by Babylon have returned to Judah and Jerusalem and are seeking to rebuild in the aftermath of the trauma and disaster of Babylonian captivity. And we believe that this period was particularly generative in terms of many of the texts that we hold up now as scripture coming together in final form. But one of the big debates, this is a really interesting period about which we could talk a lot more, but one of the big issues in this period is inclusion and exclusion. Who is part of the true Israel? How is it that we rebuild identity and form identity in this context of being a small colony on the edge of the Persian Empire and a rather divided one? Those who'd been in captivity having returned, and those who were left behind, the poor, having tried to find their way. So there's conflict within the community over who is the true Israel. And there is, as preserved in Ezra and Nehemiah, an ideology that emerges to remove the foreign women and children as a threat to the long-term survival of Israel. In fact, the book of Ezra ends, for all intents and purposes, with a whimper. The text actually, it's almost like the scribe sort of does an ellipses, not wanting to write the phrase, it's actually brought in from another text, that Israel sent away the foreign women and children. Of course, foreign women being the scapegoats of a society, among the most. Many interpreters, including myself, think even if Ruth was written earlier, there is a sense in which Ruth and Jonah, short stories for ancient Israel, offer have I frozen up?
No.
I think I'm okay. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So Ruth and Jonah emerge as counter voices to this ideology by Ezra and Nehemiah. These are voices that say, no, it's actually the foreigner, in the case of Ruth, the Moabite woman, and in the case of Jonah, it's the Ninevites who actually see and understand and appreciate the work of God. So Ruth and Jonah stand as a sort of counter voice, a counter narrative to challenge exclusive ideologies. Okay, so canonical placement matters. When does this text come together and why matters? Let me say this briefly about if you wanted to date this text, as some do, to the 10th century or the early 9th, during the time of monarchy, this text becomes very much about establishing David's credentials as king, right? This is his lineage. It may be a story, some have argued, to explain the fact that he has Moabite ancestry. He has a kind of a tricky Moabite woman in his background. And someone may have written this to say, oh yeah, she's Moabite. Yes, she was a widow, but look at how remarkable she is as a character. As a way to anticipate and perhaps rehabilitate Davidation. Okay, whenever we date it, we want to think about its significance, potential significance in that period. Now, there's another angle we need to keep in mind through the whole story, because this story can be too easily softened. I don't know a better word for this, kind of glossed over. This is a story about disaster, famine. The book opens immediately in the context of a famine. It's not the first time that people in the Bible will move as a result of famine. Abraham does this in Genesis a couple of times. And we know, of course, the book of Genesis ends with Joseph and that whole generation in Egypt as a result of famine. Famine forces people, particularly as we know in the ancient world, to migrate. We're seeing this in our own time. Famine and the search for food, lack of water, forces migration. And the family of Elimelech, into which Ruth will marry, moves from Bethlehem, which is the house of bread. They are forced to migrate to Moab. I'll say a little bit more about Moab in a moment, but they move for food. This is a crisis story, a story of trauma. And the story, the sort of level of crisis rises because the story very quickly sheds its male characters. In a patriarchy, as you know well, the ancient Near East, ancient Israel through and through, women, particularly widows and childless women, particularly women without sons, would be among the most vulnerable, alongside the orphan and the poor. The fact that the male figures are written out of this story in chapter 1 rather quickly means that the famine and crisis and the forced migration suddenly we're moving in and focusing on women who are in incredibly vulnerable positions. And we must, it seems to me, I am not the first and I will not be the last to insist on this. It's critical that we keep in mind just how vulnerable Naomi is, and certainly Ruth and Orpah are as they navigate the reality before them. So we want to think about this story in terms of vulnerabilities. We want to think about this story in terms of incredible risks that particularly Ruth takes to practice the work of gleaning on the edges of fields, picking up the leftovers that those who were gleaning had left behind, those who were working the fields had left behind. The courage that it took for her to be in the field in the first place, as we'll briefly discuss. She is subject to being harassed, molested, even raped by those who worked in the fields. Women who were on the edges were in incredibly vulnerable positions. And the kind of struggle for identity that these women are seeking to do, their strategies for survival. All about, one of the repeated words in the book is about security. Naomi says twice, I need to find security for you. And there is concern among many characters for legacy and lineage. How is it that we are going to persist, endure in the land through legacy and lineage? All right, we're going to come back to the women in a moment. Tensions through the whole book. These are all related, of course. There is a push and pull, a tension between themes of lack, hunger, death, and themes of fullness, food, and family. And there is a tension through the whole book. I think, did I just freeze up? Nope. Okay, people are moving again. And there is a theme of tension between precarity, being in a precarious state, and security. So what is it one must do to move from the most precarious of positions to a place of security? Lastly, where in the world is God in this story? Where in the world is God? Okay, one thing to note is, unlike Jonah, where God sends a fish, God makes the fish throw Jonah up, God speaks directly to Jonah. There's all of this direct engagement by God in the book of Jonah. In the book of Ruth, God is almost exclusively, except for one place, only referred to in blessing formulas or as sort of secondhand. Naomi hears that God has visited and brought food back to God's people. God is not on center stage in the book of Ruth the way God certainly is in the book of Jonah. And there is even what some have described as a theology of chance. Ruth happens upon, the text says, in a very unusual Hebrew word, Ruth happens upon the field of Boaz. And by chance, Boaz happens to come home that day and meet Ruth. There's this notion that not only, first of all, human action is critically important in driving this story, and human initiative, human care, and also that there is a bit of luck involved in having the situation work out the way that it does. The only place where God is explicitly identified as acting by the narrator is at the very end of the story, when God visits, when Boaz and Ruth are married, and God gives pregnancy to Ruth as a result. That's the only place where God is the subject of a verb, active verb, by the narrator. Everywhere else, God is part of a blessing formula, or this sort of secondhand reporting. Okay, let me pause here. Time is flying, I know. Let me pause here, stop sharing my screen, and see if there are any comments or questions before we kind of walk through the story and highlight a few things about it. Comments or questions or stunned silence or deers in headlights, or how are we doing?
We want to hear the end.
Yeah.
We're just getting, I know we're just going to get warmed up and it's going to be over, but it's was there anything in that didn't make sense or that I should clarify? All of these are kind of good habits to have as you pick up a story or pick up a biblical text, to think about these various questions and their implications. I'm not seeing any hands. Nobody's. All right, well, let's move into the story then. And what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to go chapter by chapter. I know we have really just literally 15 minutes. So what I'll do is kind of move through chapter by chapter. I'll stop after chapter 2 to see if there are questions. And then I'll move towards the last 2 chapters. If you can hang in there, you got to get to the threshing floor scene with me. That's the infamous night scene. So let's see if we can get at least that far with the time that we have. All right, let me share my screen again, and we will keep moving. All right, so let me get it to click over. Oh, this is, sorry, this is an in-between slide. I was shaped early on as a student and then eventually as a scholar by one of my teachers, Catherine Sackenfeld, now retired from Princeton Seminary. And she wrote a wonderful book, very accessible book called Just Wives. where she read stories about women in the Hebrew Bible with women all around the world. She traveled all around the world. And she, as sort of her preparation for this book, she read stories with women in all sorts of socioeconomic and geographical places in the world, to sort of see how they heard these very familiar stories. And sure enough, every time she learned something really different about these stories by reading it with people who weren't like her, didn't share the same background. And her treatment of Ruth in this book, Just Wives, really highlights, using present day comparisons, how the survival strategies we see Ruth and Naomi use in the story in order to kind of find the security. Remember, that's a repeated word in the book. In order to find some form of security in a society in which women in their position had little to no security, really no security, apart from male support, they move between a combination of short-term solutions. Gleaning is a short-term solution. It's only done right at the time of harvest. It's only possible to do it at the time of harvest. And so the season is fleeting, and you only kind of get what you get at the edges of the field. You're not guaranteed ample food by the process of gleaning. So you move between short-term food solutions, how do I just get a meal, to long-term strategies, including, as she poignantly shares in her book, seeking marriage to a wealthy man, and or seeking somehow control of some sort of land or property or field. Remembering, of course, in the ancient world, ancient Israel in particular, having land in a subsistence culture was the way to have a life, was the way to have food. You had to grow your own for the most part, or barter for what you didn't have. So somehow finding access into the patriarchal power structures by marriage and having some access to land. And she shares stories from all around the world of women who are navigating these very same challenges about how to survive, and using both short and long-term solutions to make their way in the world. Telling in her piece on this, where a young Christian girl, teenage girl, was going to marry a much older man. I think my internet just bounced. And used the Book of Ruth as a biblical warrant or encouragement doing so. I'm going to highlight just a few things. It's a great story. I do want to say something about names in this story. Names always matter. You know this. You want to kind of, what does the name mean? And when you're reading narrative story, you might wonder if the name gives us a clue about the character. So let me say a little bit about names, because we begin with a focus on the family of Elimelech and Naomi as they are caught in this storm of famine. Elimelech, the name in the Hebrew name, means my God is king, and we'll come back to this in a moment. Naomi, her name means pleasant, but as you know, when she returns to Bethlehem later in the chapter, she tells the women, change my name from Naomi. Don't call me Naomi, pleasant, any longer. Call me Mara, bitter. Why? Because God has dealt bitterly with me. So her name for Naomi, her name is a reflection of how she has experienced God's work with her in the world, her suffering. She wears in her identity, her name, her suffering. at the hands of God. God has dealt bitterly with me. The sons are named Machlon and Kilion. Machlon means sickness, death, or sterility, even, Machlon. And Kilion means consumption or annihilation. Okay, now if you know Hebrew, as soon as you read these names, what do you know about these sons? They're not going to be on the stage very long. They're sort of like Abel in the book of Genesis. Abel's based on the same Hebrew word as hevel, breath, that which is ephemeral. The name suggests Abel is not going to be around very long. So too, these men in a world, the sort of men are dying off, right? These men are not going to be on the stage very long. And sure enough, Elimelech dies, as do the Malchon and Kilion also die by the end of verse 5. So we've got a sort of sweeping of the stage. Now Ruth, the name Ruth means companion. It can also mean satisfied, depending on the Hebrew root you use. And Orpah, I wish we had more time to talk about Orpah, but Orpah's name means back of the neck. Which many associate to her. She leaves the story, right? She returns to her mother's house, and all that one sees of her, really in the narrative then, is her weeping and then the back of her neck as she follows Naomi's instructions to return to her mother. Later, we will meet Boaz, whose name means "in him is strength." Boaz is in many ways the sort of stand-in for God in the text. Boaz refers repeatedly to Ruth as my daughter. Boaz kind of finds a way for her to be amply cared for. Boaz is an agent for her own survival. So Boaz is often seen as kind of a stand-in for actions of generosity and protection and strength that God would offer. And interestingly enough, we have this character at the very end of the book, the Redeemer, the kinsman Redeemer, who really has first claim to the land that Naomi has, that we learn about in the last chapter. In Hebrew, his name is nonsensical. It's really, the Hebrew is Poloni Almoni, which really means like Mr. So-and-so, or well, people plugged in a lot of things. What's ironic about him as a character, of course, is that he refuses the land because it comes with Ruth out of concern for his inheritance and his legacy. And in the story of Israel, his name gets written out of the story. And interestingly, Ruth becomes, and her descendants become so critically important to the story, to the story of Israel. So names matter. And these characters, their names signal something significant about their role in the story. Moab, you can see in your notes if you've got a study Bible, Moab, as you know, has a very fraught relationship with Israel. It is both enemy and family. Moab, of course, is descended from the Sodom and Gomorrah story, where Lot, in Genesis 19, Lot and his daughters flee. And there's this incestuous scene where the daughters become pregnant by Lot. And Moab, this child of incestuous relationship, becomes the forefather of the region of Moab. So Moab is both familiar and enemy. In Deuteronomy, Moab is the region that refused to give the Hebrew slaves who were moving into the land of Canaan food. And as a result of their refusal to give food, God said the Moabite will never be part of the assembly of God. So the fact that Ruth is, not only is Moab the place where this family goes now for food and gets it, but also that Ruth is a Moabite casts her in an even more vulnerable position. Familiar, yet restricted, prohibited. linked with this sort of incestuous sexual background. Moab is we want to keep in mind these associations with Moab as we make our way through the story. The first chapter also plays a lot with themes of going and returning, this notion of migration and journey, and the return. Ruth's most eloquent vow to Naomi that she will forsake her mother's house and make her way back away to Bethlehem with Naomi, and take her God, take her family, take her home, die wherever Naomi dies, there Ruth will die. That very eloquent vow of fidelity and loyalty and lifelong commitment is made by this Moabite woman to a very vulnerable Naomi. Okay, I see the time. So let me move, I'm going to move a little more quickly. In Ruth 2, it's the encounter between Ruth and, this is where Boaz meets Ruth. If you were to describe Boaz, you'd probably have Boaz in him as strength. He uses long sentences. He uses a lot of blessing formulas. He clearly is a landowner. He clearly sees Ruth, his captain of those working the fields, really underscores that she's a Moabite. You can see this at the very beginning of chapter 2. She came from Moab. She's the Moabitess. There's all this underscoring. My daughter, his own leader, that she is family, that there's a kin relationship, that there's a socially embedded relationship that's important. She's vulnerable and he knows it. So he keeps the young men away from her. He urges her to glean with the young women. And what you see, if you're curious to read more about the instructions around gleaning, the texts are on the screen for you from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. This was a way that Israel sought to protect the most vulnerable, to make some food available, leave some on the edges of the field. And she not only takes from those places, but she also gathers from some of the sheaves themselves with Boaz's permission. Let me move one more step. Ruth 3. Having reported back to Naomi that she's come across, she returns with food and shares the good news with Naomi that in fact she has found a place to glean. And Naomi, urges her to stay with the women. She's in this very vulnerable place. You have an image here of the threshing floor. And this chapter 3 of Ruth happens in the cover of night. And the vulnerability of Ruth is heightened all the more, in no small way because of Naomi's instructions to her, right? Wash yourself, anoint yourself with oils, put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. Wait till he's drunk. Wait till he's eaten a lot. Wait till he kind of lies down on the threshing floor. And then position yourself, uncover his feet, maybe his feet. Feet is also a euphemism for genitalia in the ancient world, in Hebrew. And so put yourself in this very vulnerable position, and he will tell you what you are to do. Ruth does almost what she's instructed to do, and she insists to Boaz that she's seeking favor in his sight. He keeps trying to bless her, and she keeps saying, no, I need favor in your sight. He is the means to move forward as far as she is concerned. Let me just say this with mindful of our time. This night scene, Ruth could not be more vulnerable. Boaz could rape her. Other men out on the threshing floor could also have raped her. Boaz could have said anything about her and destroyed her in the community. She's incredibly vulnerable in this scene. And then the last chapter of Ruth goes from this very dark, mysterious, solitary experience with Ruth and Boaz, and pivots to a very public space where at the city gate, where jurisprudence and the market took place. This was a center, a social center. And Boaz uses his legal skills to weave together two otherwise separate laws, one about levirate marriage, the kinsman redeemer, and the other, the notion of being a kinsman redeemer, being the one who is responsible for protecting the rights of a household in the case of the death or the absence of a patriarch. So he weaves this together to the point where Ruth comes with this land that Naomi holds, and he ends up, Mr. So-and-so, Palmoni Almoni, says, I'll take the land, but I can't take Ruth. And it's then that Boaz uses his legal flair in public in order to claim both. And what we know is then God moves and Ruth becomes pregnant. And the book ends with a genealogy that takes us from Perez, go back to Genesis 38, the Tamar story, Tamar and Judah story, which is in the background of this, all the way down to King David. Okay, I need to stop. I see our time. Let me stop sharing. We're just getting warmed up. But that's
Christine.
Yes.
Christine, this is Ann. We've gotten papal dispensation to go to 10:55.
Oh, oh my gosh. Okay, so, oh gosh, now where do we go back to? So well, let me pause. Is there a part of the story? I see Barbara. Do I see your hand?
I wonder if you would comment on the fourth Chagall illustration. At first, it looks as if she's slapping him and drew blood from his cheek.
Barbara, let me see if I can share the screen. That's such a great observation. I know that Chagall's use it. Let me go back to that particular image because I just think it's so beautiful. Let me see if I can get back there. Yeah, exactly. There is such a use of color. Some of you, Barbara, you might know Chagall far better than I do. It does look like he's bleeding. What I don't know is what I've heard about that image is that it is the red on all characters is indicative of passion, of this sort of